Welcome to Love for the Truth Radio, a program devoted to encouraging you to be a contender of the faith in an ever-changing church culture. On Love for the Truth Radio, we will discuss current issues and challenging views along with biblical truth that can affect our Christian worldview and how we live out our faith. And now, here's your host, Cindy Hartline.
Welcome to Love for the Truth. We have an exciting show for today. You know, it's obvious that we are on a pathway headed towards a one world government propagated by deep state political agendas and powers in high places who apparently have the resources and ability to cause a need for government control. Currently, there are some protesters who are being funded to stir up a societal need for high security, causing lawlessness in the streets and destruction to many businesses. The more chaos, the more need, the more government control. There are many questions concerning the COVID-19 pandemic, but we'll save that for another show. To establish a one world order, government control is essential. An economical collapse, societal disorder, lawlessness, and a pandemic all are inevitable situations for government to take control, and more often than not are stimulated by the George Soros and others in high places. But there are also civil societies that have the same global narrative for a one world order called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which in my opinion are more powerful and cunning because they are secretly setting the stage for globalization through 10 million of these organizations worldwide, which are encouraged and supported by the United Nations and have been for years. Well, we will be discussing the cult of world order with guest Carl Teichrib, author of Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. Carl Teichrib, a researcher, writer, and lecturer, focuses on the paradigm shift sweeping the Western world, including the challenges and opportunities faced by Christians. Over the years, Carl has attended a range of internationally significant political, religious, and social events in his quest to understand the historical and contemporary forces of transformation, including the United Nations Millennium Forum. Since the mid-1990s, Carl's research has been utilized by numerous authors, media hosts, and documentary producers, pastors, professors, and students, and interested laypeople. From 2007 until the end of 2015, Carl edited a monthly web-based magazine, Forcing Change, documenting and detailing the worldview revolution underway, points of pressures, and forces of change. Carl Teichrib frequently speaks to church groups in conference settings and occasionally teaches a modular course on secular pagan trends at Myler College of the Bible. His biases are transparent. He embraces an evangelical Christian perspective, is pro-liberty versus politically imposed equality, pro-individualistic versus consensus collectivism, and pro-free market. Welcome, Carl Teichrib. It's a pleasure to have you on Love for the Truth Radio again.
Oh, it's good to be back. And you know something, during this crazy time of the COVID virus and everything else that's going around, the protests, it's good to be able to talk to people of like mind.
Yes, and I think a lot of minds have been opened. A lot of eyes are seeing now beyond what we sometimes see through the media. So I'm really excited about this show, The Cult of World Order. And Carl, in your book, Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment, I love that book, by the way. But in chapter 11, your focus is on the cult of world order, which I believe is a very compelling topic and one that is applicable to what we are currently experiencing with COVID-19 pandemic and protest policies concerning the death of George Floyd. All that's going on now is actually setting the stage for a world order. We've talked about that on our show many times. But your chapter opens, I thought, very interesting, with a quote by Scott Nearing. World crises and world chaos cannot be successfully handled in the absence of world authority. And now I know that in the context that you were approached with, it says you were immediately presented with the question when you attended the UN Millennium Forum in May of 2000. You were presented with the question, which organization are you representing? And I thought, this is a very prophetic question that I believe applies to our stance today, and one I would like to propose to our listening audience at the end of this broadcast, because I pray that their eyes would be open and their heart would receive what we have to say. Can you paint a picture of the environment and what transpired at that United Nations Millennium meeting?
Yes, sure. And for your audience, it was 20 years ago that I attended this event, and it was one of the main Millennium United Nations events that took place in the year 2000. There was a handful, more than a handful, but a handful that were considered to be truly cutting edge. The Millennium Forum was one of them, and that was a gathering of roughly 1,400 representatives from non-governmental organizations, pressure groups. These are all leaders of civil society organizations. And they had been invited by the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan. Back already in 1997, he had issued a call, kind of an invitation for the NGO community to come together in the year 2000 to sit down with the United Nations, to sit down with each other, and in this hub of world networking, this place where the world is coming together, we as NGOs would begin to reshape and reformat what world order would look like. We would look to see what would the United Nations, what is the vision of the United Nations that we would conceive of during that week. And it was roughly a week-long event. Now, later on in the fall, the world leaders got together. It was called the United Nations Millennium Summit. And at that point, there were hundreds of governmental officials, a lot of heads of state. And they were coming together at the exact same time. Mikhail Gorbachev had his State of the World Forum take place in New York City. It was dovetailing with the summit. And this was all happening in September. Our event was in May, but the other two events were happening in September, and they were kind of a revolving door. One would go from Mikhail Gorbachev's State of the World Forum, and then they would go into the Millennial Summit, and it would be this rotating back and forth. Our job, Cindy, for the NGO part of it, which took place in May, our job was to help set the stage, to help bring about kind of a vision for what would take place in the September meetings. The voices of the NGO community, the goal was that our voices then could come together. We could put declarations in place. Those declarations would be handed off to the heads of state. Those declarations would help set the tone for what the world would look like in the new millennium. Because keep in mind, this is excitement. This is the end, the end of not just a decade, not just a century. It was the end of the millennium. And we were going to reshape what the world looked like. And we were going to reshape it in our image. That was the bottom line.
Yeah, what an interesting concept. And what's interesting is, if I was at one of those meetings before I even knew the Lord, I probably would have been so excited. I'm going to be part of this big community to reshape, the future. How exciting that is. But what was their perspective? I thought in your book it said, quoted, "We the peoples," which was the title of the UN Secretary General's rallying reports. What was their perspective, meaning we the peoples?
It wasn't your perspective. It wasn't the perspective of your audience. The NGO community that supports world government and global governance, it was their perspective.
Yes.
It was their vision, not your vision. And indeed, you would not have found a lot. I did know there was a couple of people who were there as journalists who had conservative values, but you would not have found many people from NGOs who were in attendance that had conservative values. That just wasn't there. Instead, the NGOs that were present, for the most part, supported empowering the United Nations. They supported creating a strong robust world order built around multilateralism, built around the United Nations system, not just the UN itself, but all the other components that go into it, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. There was a lot of discussion about how to integrate all of these moving parts into one forward direction. And so we the people, here's the thing, when they say we the people, it gives them moral legitimacy. It gives them a sense of we're the ones who are now speaking on everybody's behalf.
Yes.
They're not speaking on your behalf. They're not speaking on my behalf, but they have now a moral position. In many respects, the NGO community considers itself to be the consciousness of the global community.
Yes. Isn't that interesting? So, even though everybody has their own voice to reshape this future, the voices of the NGO, and there's many of them, they are still pressure type groups that are segueing in this we the people for this UN perspective. What are some of the other organizations that attended there that you would say that are really more prevalent that we may be aware of today even?
There was a number of organizations that were there that I don't even think they really knew why they were there. One of them was the Girl Scouts. They were there. The Salvation Army was there. There was a lot of groups there that they just come because they're invited in, and they have a voice. They have a say. They're not the ones though pushing the agenda for the most part. They're there, and their representatives are going to working groups on peace or working groups on economic development or social development. But then there's a lot of other groups that were pushing the agenda and that were kind of writing the script for this event. And the one that sticks out for me, and this might not be one your listeners know much about, it's the World Federalist Movement. And the World Federalist Movement is the longest running pro-world government organization. It has been in active duty since the 1940s. It came about during World War II. During World War II, there's a whole history of world government groups that popped up. And at the end of the war, it looked like they would help, and they were helping to shape the United Nations. But it was, their goal was to have not just the United Nations that we have today. Their goal was to make it robust, to make it more like a world government or a world federalism. And these organizations, some of them folded, some of them amalgamated into new organizations, new bodies. But the one that has stuck through it all, and kind of there's a thread going back to World War II, is the World Federalist Movement. I, at that time, had been going to a lot of World Federalist Association meetings. Now, that's the American branch of the World Federalist Movement. And so these guys were running the show, and I write about that in Chapter 11. I mean, Cindy, I didn't realize how much they were running the show until I arrived to get my security clearance and to walk into the General Assembly. And when I went to go get my security clearance and finish off my paperwork, the guys behind the desk are all people I knew from attending World Federalist Association meetings in Dallas and Washington, D.C., and in Chicago. All of a sudden, I'm looking at them and they're looking at me, and you need to understand, I went there as an accredited independent expert. That's how I was listed. But here's the kicker. I wasn't. I was considered part of the World Federalist Movement. And so I was there to help shape it in that direction.
Isn't that something? Well, we will be right back with Carl Teichrib. We're going on a break. We're going to be talking about establishing this new pathway. What does it look like? And what are we seeing today? So please stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back. So please stay tuned.
If you're a first-time listener, you'll find that on Love for the Truth Radio, we discuss news and views from a biblical worldview. We believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God and the absolute truth that should be applied to every aspect of life. We don't proclaim to have a cap on the truth, but we do have a love for biblical truth. So please, take everything you hear on this radio program to study and prayer, And thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, and our guest today is Carl Teichrib. He has attended a range of internationally significant political, religious, and social events in his quest to understand the historical and contemporary forces of transformation, including the United Nations Millennium Forum. And that's what we've been talking about today, and how that forum is helping to reshape the future. And we're seeing that a lot of that has come to fruition since 2000. Carl, how has that enlightened you back in 2000, but also today, how we're seeing the progression of these NGOs?
Oh, good question. Well, first of all, I'm still seeing what we talked about back then. I'm still seeing that being talking points, and not just talking points, but political action points today. When I was at the UN Millennium Forum, I sat in on what was called Subgroup 6, which was the title for Subgroup 6 was Strengthening and Democratizing the UN and Other International Organizations. Their whole goal was to empower the United Nations. So we talked about establishing United Nations-based international taxing structures. We talked about creating a carbon tax. Now, for me, as a Canadian, that's significant because my country implemented a carbon tax not too long ago. Wow. And it didn't come from their thinking. This was stuff being talked about 20 years ago plus. And so the things that were being discussed at that point are still in circulation today. There was a lot of talk back then of starting what was called a Global People's Assembly, basically a United Nations World Parliament. Now this is important. Listen, back in May of this year, May 2020, the United Nations had an online NGO virtual conference entitled the UN 75 People's Declaration, and it was the People's Forum for the UN We Need. That was their title.
Wow. The
UN 75 People's Forum for the UN We Need. It was literally a parallel to what I experienced 20 years ago, talking about some of the same things, talking specifically about the need to create a United Nations World Parliament and how that would look. Would it be elected officials? Would it be representatives of NGOs? How would this come about? So they're still talking, they're still planning about the things that we put in motion literally 2 decades ago.
That's interesting. That is so interesting. So the UN Millennium's meeting's purpose was to establish a new pathway apart from governmental representation geared towards a civil society. And I think that's what I want to focus on, Carl, is that, we're seeing a lot of destruction and protests and, health problems and everything. But we're seeing, well, actually, we may not be seeing it, maybe like behind the scenes, but there is an establishing of a new pathway towards this new world order through these civil societies. And that's what I want to highlight here, is that they're actually civil societies, these NGOs, but they are, I guess in a very cunning way, I would say, establishing these pathways.
Well, and people need to realize that each one of these NGOs that are participating have their own agendas. They have their own vision. They're working with big ideas, but they also work with overlapping vision. So back at the Millennium Forum, and also at the one that took place in May of this year, the UN We Need Virtual Summit, you saw the World Federalist Movement. You saw the Baha'i international community. The Baha'is and the World Federalists both are looking forward to the same thing, a world government. And in the Baha'i faith, they have prophecies that say that we will have an era of global peace that will emerge when humanity recognizes their oneness with all things, when we have a world government, when we have a single global currency, when we have a world judicial system, we have world leadership. Then they've been striving for that. In fact, at the UN Millennium Forum, the Baha'i international community, they were leading many of the working sessions. Their chairman The chairman of the Millennium Forum was a representative of the Baha'i international community, working hand in hand with the World Federalist Movement.
Mm-hmm.
So, these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations that have this vision of global oneness,
Mm-hmm.
they have a lot of clout. They have a very broad base and a very very large voice. Not one that maybe you hear or the average person might hear, but in terms of shaping the international conversation,
Mm-hmm.
they've been very, very much a part of that. Here's a crazy thing. When Obama transitioned, when he took his office from George Bush and that transition team was set in place,
Mm-hmm.
the transition team for the Obama administration was comprised of at least 2 members of the World Federalist community who were helping the Obama administration to understand international affairs.
Mm-hmm.
The International Criminal Court came through the World Federalist movement.
Wow.
There's a lot of different things you can point to, even in my own country, like I said, the carbon tax. So they have a voice behind the scenes in such a way that academics listen, policymakers listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
They are always lobbying governments. When I went to back in, oh golly, this is even before the Millennium Forum. I went to a number of different World Federalist meetings. We were given lists of congressmen to visit and senators to visit, and with talking points of how to bring the World Federalist message to those offices.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and Carl, as much as they seem very diverse and maybe individualized, like, okay, well, they're doing this and doing that. How are they bringing together this one world government kind of global conversation, or international conversation, as you said? These NGOs, they are recognized as non-governmental groups. They are accredited but they are accredited to the United Nations. See, and that's what I want to talk about, because they agree with certain principles and have a stake in the global narrative, as you've quoted on your page 321 on your book. I want to talk about that even though they say they're non-governmental, there's still certain principles and policies that they are agreeing to and with the United Nations.
Right. It's not just simply that they're like setting up bake sales and doing community functions.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness, they're trying to project their voice into the highest level of politics. They could, maybe the better way of describing them is they're pressure groups. They're global pressure groups. They're not just simply service-oriented organizations. No, they're exerting pressure.
There you go.
And that.
Yeah, and with that said, I know that you'd mentioned that some of the NGOs have benign platforms, like maybe the Girl Scouts or whatever, and it seems like they're just all in this, like you said, just kind of being a community. But speaking of global pressure groups, there are NGOs that support the Lucy Trust that play a major role. So what about these big groups that are really making a difference in reshaping the future?
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you brought up. I mean, Lucis Trust was one of the contributing organizations to the Millennium Forum. That organization should ring a bell if you study the New Age movement, because Lucis Trust was originally Lucifer Publishing Company, and it was founded by Alice Bailey as a theosophical publishing house for her channeled writings. They were one of the groups that was there. In fact, at the Millennium Forum, one afternoon, and I've got this in my files, one afternoon we were all handed out the Great Invocation, an occult prayer.
Wow. Look at that.
I mean, it is a place where politics overlaps with some pretty big spiritual ideas.
So we're not only gathering together as a pressure group to forward this reshaping, this global narrative, but now we're also bringing in a specific spirit to this thing, Like you said, especially with this Alice Bailey. I mean, Lucy Trust, am I saying that right, plays a major role. And that Alice Bailey actually wrote a lot of her, I guess, her prayers or her books or whatever by channeling.
That's right. Yes.
By channeling spiritually. So, can you enlighten us on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, and if you take and read her writings, especially her writings, her books, where she focuses on a coming world master, a coming world teacher, and how the world will be coming together as one, and how we will have a form of world order or world government. And there is a coming time when a world master will step foot upon the world stage and will set things in order. And this was all; these were channeled messages. Her books are channeled writings.
Yes.
And so she has opened up her mind to allow an outside entity, an outside spiritual entity, to write through her. And it wasn't just that she was sitting down with pen and paper and coming up with these ideas on her own. She makes that very clear. And so Lucis Trust, her organization, they still play a very important role as a non-governmental organization at the United Nations. And you can go online, they've got their own web pages, and they've got material that you can purchase. And I mean, they're still a player. In fact, they're a very considerable player, because Lucis Trust and the ideas around Lucis Trust influenced people like the former United Nations official Robert Mueller, who was, he passed away a few years ago already, but Robert Mueller's hand at the United Nations was very important. He was considered the prophet of hope at the United Nations.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
And a lot of his worldview was shaped by some of those same teachings.
Isn't that interesting? What you had said that what she brings, or what Lucy Trust brings, is this coming world master and teacher, or world master on the stage. That sounds like they're setting the stage for the Antichrist, obviously. So, as we're reshaping this global conversation, we're reshaping people's minds to believe that we're going to need someone who is going to run this total one world order, and obviously that would be the Antichrist.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the documents I picked up at the Millennium Forum, and I've shared this on other shows. I have it in my book. In fact, I have it quoted in Game of Gods. It was a document entitled "Transformation of the World," and in this document, and I'll share it after the break. This document called for a world king.
Isn't that interesting? Well, we're going on a break, so I know you're on the edge of your seat. You got to stay tuned. Carl Teichrib has a lot more to say about changing the minds of the people.
Many would agree that we are living in unprecedented times. Grave immorality is on the rise, as in the days of Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. There are wars and rumors of wars as nations rise against nations. Prophecy is being fulfilled as the birth pangs become quicker and harder. These are the signs of the return of Jesus Christ. There is one sign often left untaught. Jesus also told the disciples in the Olivet Discourse to take heed that no man deceive you. This warning applies to us too. Deception has infiltrated the churches through many false teachings and movements, making apostasy paramount. As contenders of the faith, we do our best to research and discuss these false teachings for you, the listener. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline. Our guest today is Carl Teichrib, and he has so much to say about what's going on in the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that actually support the United Nations. And these are organizations that seemingly are behind the scenes, but they are really powerful. And I think something that we need to keep our eyes open to, especially when it comes to religion and as well as politics. I mean, what we're seeing here, Carl was talking about, and he's going to finish what he was saying about how there's this spiritual thing going on, that they're one in mind and one in spirit. And Carl, why don't you finish what you were saying before the break?
Yeah, sure. The document that was passed out to us, now, it wasn't a United Nations document. It was a document put together by the head of the World Assembly of Turkic Peoples. And so the little document was titled Transformation of the World. I'm going to read this. And again, I have this quoted in Game of Gods. If people want to look it up, if people want to be able to snip copy sections out of it, it's really a telling little segment here. And he was proposing a world king, a humanistic world king, because we need some kind of leadership.
Yeah.
This is what his document says. Small doubt that the world does need a civilized coordinator in international relations and in settling global problems. More than that, this coordinator must be a stabilizing factor, actually the last-ditch authority on the earth. He must win confidence of each man and each nation. People must be stark sure that this coordinator would solve any problem in a just and humane way. And one should be sure that in him he would find understanding and sympathy, that he would treat any nation as his own son, that he is indeed the last resort, and the man should convince his terrestrial brothers therein by his practical deeds. Can the world community do without a coordinator? Definitely cannot.
Oh, interesting.
I know, Cindy, when I read that at the UN Forum, my jaw's on the ground because I'm going, this isn't just politics anymore. This is a savior.
It is a savior. Yeah. Oh my gosh, when you were reading that, I was like, oh, you got to be. And it's funny how they're calling him, the Antichrist, a coordinator.
Yes.
A coordinator, and that we have to have. He's trying to get confidence from the people in what he is coordinating. And he understands, you can see the compassion, he understands what they're going through. But what's interesting, it says this is the last resort, and obviously it will be the last resort, for the Antichrist, because we know that then the Lord will be on the scene. But go on, share what you've got to share, Carl. This is so interesting.
Well, yeah, people need to understand that that when we're talking about politics at this level, what we're really talking about is a religious mindset. And that's why I entitled Chapter 11, The Cult of World Order.
The cult,
because it is a belief that humanity's redemption lies in the governing of humanity. And I write this on page 377. In fact, I'm going to read. It's kind of presumptuous of me, but I'll read my own quote.
Yeah, go ahead.
It could be said this way: humanity's redemption lies in the governance of human unity, and the safeguarding of Earth is our collective holy mission. World government is the organized political manifestation of this ideal. Now, again, what that really is saying is our salvation comes when we become unified. It's really the Tower of Babel being rebuilt for today's world, and we call it politics, but the bottom line is it's a competitive it's a worldview that is in competition to the biblical worldview, because it's saying we save ourselves. Do you remember Jean Stapleton, the actress?
Yes.
Okay, she was a World Federalist supporter. I have a statement along with John Denver, Walter Cronkite, Lloyd Bridges. They were all World Federalist supporters. But Jean Stapleton, her endorsement of the World Federalists reads like this. This is her quote. Keep in mind, this is politics, but boy, does this sound like religion.
Yeah.
Here's her statement. The goal of the World Federalists is peace through unity of government. We must support their vision of oneness in diversity, for it is the salvation of humanity. And you can find that on page 378 of my book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's religious.
It's very religious. And by the way, folks, really, the name of Carl's book is Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. You've got to get a hold of this book. Look, I don't promote anything. I really don't. Usually on our show, we allow our guests to mention it. But I have to tell you, it's one of my favorite books because it enlightens us as to what is going on today. You know, you say, like, we look at these protests, we look at the COVID-19 and we say, okay, there's something else going on. What is it? Read his book. You will find out. It will enlighten you. I would say get a copy. Amazon, go to Amazon. It's called The Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. And I'll tell you, it has enlightened. I'm on the edge of my seat every time I read his book. And it's just so comprehensive that you can't get it all in your brain in one shot. You can take maybe one chapter at a time or half a chapter at a time. And basically, we're only talking about one part of one chapter, right, Carl, here? So,
right. Literally only a couple of pages.
Yeah, that's all we're doing. This whole thing is all about a couple of pages. So you can imagine how much information you're going to get, you know. So, yeah, it is. It's about religion and politics. And that's how they're setting the stage for the New World Order. The New World Order has to have a religion. That's why we see ecumenism on the rise today. You know, diverse religions and coming together, one mind and one spirit. And what does that sound like? It's the counterfeit. Satan is the counterfeit, you know, to what God is trying to do, to bring us into one mind and one spirit, to love him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love others as we understand that love to be. And that is in one mind, one heart, and one spirit. And that's exactly what the enemy is going to try to do. And can you imagine he's doing this through civil society, you know, so as well as some of the things that we're seeing going on today. So, Carl, I want to talk about, unless you have another thought, but let's talk about how the NGOs, as you said in your book, are acting as apostles for a world body and how their interests are authenticated. Their voice and visions do gain stature, visibility, and reach. You mentioned that in your book. I don't know if you want to take one specific organization. You did mention a few, and just share how this is progressing.
Oh, sure. You know, and I'll maybe just help your listeners to kind of piece this together.
Okay.
So what happens is at events like the World, like the United Nations Millennium Forum, or any of the other events, like we've got one coming up. I believe it's in later in the fall. It might even be in December, and it's taking place in Scotland. It is the next big United Nations climate change summit. So you have, before the event even transpires, you have NGOs coming together with governments, coming together with the United Nations. They already have what's called preparatory meetings, and these preparatory meetings take place months in advance, sometimes years in advance of the actual event. And the NGO communities are brought in to help steer and guide the conversation. They add their vision into it. They add their goals, their aspirations. And sometimes there are governments who don't appreciate that.
Right.
But for the most part, the United Nations has made a way for the NGO community to bring their voice to the table. And so when all of a sudden you're hearing on the news of a climate change summit in Paris, or a climate change summit wherever it might be, or any of the other major United Nations events that transpire every year, know that behind that event has already been a very broad, comprehensive consultation time. You've got reports that have been published prior, so that when the event occurs, there already is an agenda that's firmly put in place.
Yeah.
And now what's happening at the rest of that event is the negotiating of that agenda, the going through the fine points of it, making it now applicable, trying to find ways to either strengthen it or to take out weak points and bring it forward to the world table. So in terms of the mechanism of how this works, it's a complex moving engine, and the NGO component does play an important part. But people don't, unless you actually integrate yourself into that world. And I've done that a little bit, more than probably most people listening to this show, but I've integrated myself substantially into that world. Unless you do that, you don't see how these working components move together. This is the important part sometimes, Cindy, of going to events like this. You can observe, you watch, you see who is talking to who are the rock stars at these events, which person, which organization has the of major shakers and people of importance. And so when you can observe this, you leave the event, you have everything documented, but it also gives me a starting point to be able to say, okay, I've got to dig into that group more. I've got to understand that organization better, because they obviously have the ear of important people. And that's the importance of going to events like this, because just reading documents, reading articles, it is certainly helpful and will give you a perspective. But that perspective becomes one layer deeper when you spend time quietly rubbing shoulders in their midst and listening to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's one of a kind, that's Carl Teichrib, that goes to these events that has a biblical worldview. And so I'll tell you, Carl, it's a pleasure having you with us to even enlighten us on these things. You had mentioned that these are apostles, for a world body. And just as the apostles in the Bible have made churches all over, here they're making these organizations and building them up and strengthening them up and nurturing them and cultivating them as they build this global consciousness, okay? And that's what I want to talk about, is that these NGOs become a voice of global conscious. And I want to relate this perspective to Satan being the prince and power of the air, Carl. Let's give examples how, they're trying to bring this one mind, not only in religion and politics, but now also in Mother Earth, and all of this is coming together.
Yes, and even with what we're seeing with the COVID situation, what we're seeing with the protests happening, all of this points to the chaos that causes mankind to scream out, we need hope. Yeah. We need something or someone to give us direction. We need a coordinator. We need somebody to save us. With great crisis comes that opportunity, and world crisis and world chaos, as you said earlier in the show, is important.
Yes, we're going on a break. And we'll be right back with Carl Teichrib for our last segment in World Democracy and summarizing the cult of world order. So please stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we read that men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, without self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. They will be ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. With us is Carl Teichrib, and Carl's been talking about his book, Game of Gods, Temple of Man in the Age of Re-Enchantment. And, you got to get a hold of this book. It just will enlighten you as to what really is going on behind the scenes today. Carl, in light of the UN's motto, and I wanted to just jump right over here, is their motto is to gather to make the world in our image. And we see that as the ultimate counterfeit. From mind to image. They want to change our mind to a global conscious, now to making people in their image. And you said that the NGO UN Interplay at the United Nations Millennium Forum was geared to something more transformational, more profound. Those were your words. The visionary construction of futures. We gather to remake the world in our image. And isn't that something? Because that's exactly what the Lord does through his word. He changes our mind, we repent, we learn from his written word, to change our mind, become more moral people, pure, before him, set apart from worldly ways, and also that our minds are changed to worship God, and then also to change in his image, to be more Christ-like. And here we're seeing the Antichrist work through these NGOs or the United Nations motto to make the world or remake the world in their image. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure. When I put it like that, that was the motto. That kind of it wasn't expressed like that, but that's the feeling and the flavor that came through it. We were rebuilding the world in the image that we wanted. Mm-hmm. Now, this is important, and I'm glad you brought in the fact that we're supposed to be remade in Christ's image. On this past Sunday, I was teaching an adult Sunday school lesson on Colossians chapter 3. Now, in Colossians chapter 3, the passage there, Paul is talking about how we're to be made a new man or a new self in light of the fact that now it's Christ doing that work in us. Mm-hmm. The old man is put away, the new man is being made. There is that biblical understanding that we are made in the image of God, that we are supposed, not that we're gods, mm-hmm. no, but we are to exemplify and be literally his representative here on earth, exhibiting righteousness, holiness, compassion, love, forgiveness, putting on those characteristics of Jesus Christ. So this theme of creating in a new image is so important. If you take a look at what the Soviet Union was doing 100 years ago with Lenin and then later on with Stalin, it was all about creating the new Soviet man. If you take a look at Soviet propaganda posters, the new Soviet man was going to be a worker. He was going to be involved in class warfare. He was the vanguard, and every individual in the Soviet Union was to be remade into the new Soviet man. Communist China had the same kind of idea, that from the rice paddies to the revolutionary front line, you would be made into the new revolutionary man. Adolf Hitler, National Socialism, again, had this idea of you would be created now into a new image. You would be the German ideal, the German Nazi socialist ideal. You would be created into a new man. We were going to remake you into our image. We do that. We're constantly searching for, okay, who am I? What is my purpose? What is my meaning? What is my sense of destiny? Well, all of these counterfeits, including at the United Nations, we're going to make you now into the image of a global citizen. And being in the image of a global citizen means your purpose, your sense of worth, value, and importance comes from you reflecting now our global values. All of this is a counterfeit to, in Colossians, the Apostle Paul saying, no, you're supposed to be made in the image of Christ. The new man, the true new man, is to reflect your Creator. And in these cases, all these examples I gave you, including what we're doing to create global citizens, is a counterfeit of that. Yes. It's saying, no, creation will remake itself in the image of what creation wants.
This is so interesting because we talk about being made in in the image of a global citizen, Carl. I see this as a, quote, form of worship, because we are seeking out to reflect, to be an example of, to be one in spirit of, to be one in mind of. And all of this really suggests a form of worship. Worship is not just going to church and listening to music and raising your hands and singing to God. Worship is how we live, move, and have our being in Christ. So if we're made in the image as a global citizen, there are certain shared ethics and values in service towards this, one world image, that people have to line up with to become that. And that's what I want to talk about this world democracy that's on the rise with cultural and spiritual concerns. So we talked about not only being one in politics, one in religion, one in saving the earth, or whatever. But now there's also ethics and values that have to line up, to be this, quote, global citizen. Let's talk about that.
Sure, yeah, and where that comes through the most in terms of the conditioning, it comes through your education system, and it also comes through your media. But what's fascinating is, as you unpack what it means to be a global citizen, what the image you're being made into is the image of a social justice warrior.
Oh, wow, that's good.
And that takes us right to the heart of what we have seen transpire this year.
Wow. I mean, I think that was a bingo for me, this social justice warrior, because years ago we saw the churches, kind of falling prey. And it's really good to go out and help people, and we were always to do that, to be an example, to go visit those who are in prison and in the hospitals and take care of the widows and all of that. But this word social justice has come up through the church, in the last 15 years. I don't hear it as much as I did maybe 7 years ago. But social justice, we all have to get together and serve. And here we have it, this social justice warrior now in this.
Yes.
Yeah.
But as what you just described in terms of the church, compassion, helping the poor, the widows, we should not be calling that social justice. We should be calling that what it is. Yeah. Compassion. Yeah. That is compassion. Social justice has a political ideal and a political element to it. It's about reshaping civilization around victim narratives. Whether there's a real victim, and there usually are real victims, no question. I mean, there are things that happen. There's stuff that goes on all the time. We know it, we feel it, we experience it. But with social justice, it's not the individual who has committed an atrocity or a crime that you're looking to seek justice around. No, now it becomes entire groups, entire ethnicities, entire cultures. And so we have then at that point, we have stepped way beyond compassion, and we're entering a value system. We're entering a system of values and ethics, and it's radical in its approach, and it is typically socialist in its approach. And so that's what being a good global citizen ends up looking like. That's why when you attend college and university now, or even, my goodness, high school and even elementary school, so much of it is built around, well, now you're going to be involved in climate change activism. You're going to be around eco-justice, all of this stuff. I saw this stuff coming, Cindy. Wow. The very first event I went to was back in 1997 on creating global citizens, and it was all about understanding that we're doing this because we're moving towards one world. And the only way that we can save ourselves is if we become global citizens, we become activists for one world. That's
so interesting. And that, as you were saying that, Carl, I'm saying, well, that's exactly what's going on right now with the protests, right? Social justice. We're going to be warriors for this. We're going to do it in a radical way. We're going to get what we want. We need social justice. So wow, you could just see that coming to fruition,
Yeah. So you see these ideals, these big ideals.
Yes.
From the United Nations perspective, right down to your neighborhood.
Exactly. That's what we're seeing right now. I mean, I think we've seen it through COVID-19. We need to do this together for all of us to survive. We need to protest, because we're making a statement here, and this is social justice, and we're going to fight for this. I just think it's so interesting. You recently attended a UN 2020 virtual conference wasn't it called A Reimagined Future in celebration of the UN's 75th anniversary? Was that it?
Yeah, it was. It was about the idea of the United Nations we need. That was really the push that they were focusing on. Yeah. The United Nations that we need, and it was in many respects just simply a carryover of what took place 20 years ago. I mean, the Baha'i international community was putting this together. The World Federalists were there. Another group, a newer group called Together First. And the language that you heard so much was, we need to build back better. Now, when they say that, what they're referring to is, all right, the world is going through this crisis mode. When we come out of the crisis mode, we have to have an enhanced United Nations, an enhanced world system. We will build that better than when we went into the crisis. So they talked a lot about pooling sovereignty at regional and global levels. They talked about that this can't be a debate or a discussion anymore. Now it's the time to act. We need to put together a commission on global governance. That was one of the suggestions. Another suggestion, and it was talked about a fair amount, was the importance of having a global people's assembly, because there's a campaign now for that. Gro Harlem Brundtland, she's one of the founding members of the Global Elders, and she was the World Health Organization Secretary General during the SARS crisis. She talked about how COVID is an opportunity for world partnership. It has to be the center point of pooling our national programs together. One of the United Nations officials that was talking brought up that the UN system needs teeth, and teeth that bite.
Oh, wow. Look at that. Yeah. Sounds like the enemy to me.
Yeah. I'm like, no thanks.
No
thanks.
no.
That's not what we need.
No, we don't.
It's always placed within the context of, this is our last and only real hope. At the UN Millennium Forum 20 years ago, I heard this line over and over and over again, that the United Nations is man's last hope. I'm sorry.
Wow.
It's not.
Isn't that something? You said something that before, and I had wrote it down, is that we're reshaping a cultivization really of victims. And I don't know, that just really hit me, because when we look at what's happening today, I don't mean to keep going back, but with this protesting, it's about people that felt like they've been victimized, right? And we need now to reshape a civilization, because of how we've been victimized. I don't know, maybe I'm getting off. But anyway, we have to go. We go into another break. We've heard a lot from Carl, and he'll be back to give us final advice and contact information. So please stay tuned. I want to personally thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio. Please visit our website at www.loveforthetruthradio.com. That's www.loveforthetruthradio.com. Well, we've had guest Carl Teichrib offer such a wealth of information concerning this agenda for the New World Order, which we call the cult of a New World Order. And Carl, I want to conclude where we left off. What's your final advice on that?
Well, I'm glad before the break you brought it around a little bit to what was taking place today with victimization. Listen, nobody has a monopoly on suffering. Every human being experiences pain and suffering. We all have joy, we all have sorrows, but nobody, not a single group, has a monopoly on suffering. And yet, as we see the world just going into it, in the turmoil that it is, you're going to see that what's really being shouted for is they want hope in something. They either want, they have their own view of what the world should look like, whether it's the United Nations or whatever. But everybody needs hope. Everybody needs hope. But your hope is not going to be found in your victim narrative. It's not going to be found in being a global citizen. Your hope is not found in social activism, and is sure not found at the United Nations or in the realm of international politics. Your hope is only found in the one person, the God of this world, the God of literally this world and all of the universe, not the God of the world of that we know of in terms of Satan, but the one who created it all, and that is Jesus Christ.
Amen. And I just thank you, Carl, for offering that. And I want to propose this question, because I did in the beginning when you were asked, when you went to the meeting, which organization are you representing? And I said it was a very prophetic question that applies to our stance today, and one that I would like to propose to our listening audience at the end of this broadcast. And I made that statement in segment 1. And the proposal is not so much as what organization are you representing, but who are you representing? And, we talked about, through the whole entire show about how this agenda is trying to reshape our future by changing our minds, changing our image. And there's only one person that can change our mind when we repent, and that's Jesus Christ, as Carl was saying. When we read the word, it changes our mind. And there's only one that can change our heart, too. So anyway, Carl, can you offer also your contact information?
Sure. People can find me on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook. And if you want to read excerpts of the book and learn more about it, go to gameofgods.ca, gameofgods.ca.
Wonderful. And again, I usually don't promote a lot of materials, but here, this is my favorite book, Game of Gods, The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. Thank you, Carl, so much. You've given us a wealth of information. You've enlightened our eyes, opened our eyes to see. Thank you, listeners, for listening all the way to the end. God bless, and we'll see you next week.